WIPO is the World Intellectual Property Organization that protects intellectual property and encourages creative activities worldwide. WIPO serves as the global IP office, setting international standards for intellectual property rights.
You need international protection,
Yes.
not local protection. And we do the international protection.
With a keen interest in the intellectual property enhanced by Korea's advanced technologies, he is currently visiting Korea while also finding time to be in the Heart to Heart studio. Today, society has entered the era of the fourth industrial revolution. Value creation based on intellectual property has risen as a noteworthy industry. And it has given birth to all sorts of conflicts with regards to intellectual property rights. Thus, WIPO's role in protecting intellectual property worldwide is becoming ever more critical. On today's Heart to Heart, we will hear from Francis Gurry, Director General of WIPO, about the organization and its wide-ranging activities. Well, thank you so much for joining us here in the studio today on
It's my
Heart to
pleasure.
Heart, and welcome back to Korea.
Thank you very much.
I believe that you have visited Korea quite a number of times.
Yes, probably about 7 or 8 times, but 3 times in my current position.
3 times. So how does it feel to be back?
Well, great. Every time I come, things have changed, things have moved. It's such a dynamic country, so it's extremely interesting to come,
Yes.
having with an interval between visits.
I know that you are on a very tight schedule, and yes, you are here with us. So I've got many questions for you. We'll
Sure.
try to get through the questions very quickly. Now, WIPO, the World
Sure.
Intellectual Property Organization, protects intellectual property, also known as IP,
right.
and also encourages creative activities worldwide. So I would like to begin by asking you to kindly explain to us what intellectual property, IP, means, and also tell us about the main roles of WIPO.
It's all that goes into production or distribution of goods and services that comes from here as opposed to here. You know, so it's the intellectual input. So what's that mean? It means the functionality of a product, so that's the technology. It means what a product looks like,
Okay.
that's the design. It means the branding of the product, but it's also creative works. So it's all of the intellectual activity that has an economic value, and what WIPO does is that we assure an international protection and cooperation in relation to all of that. You need international protection,
Yes.
not local protection. And we do the international protection.
What might be some of the issues regarding copyright and industrial property that you have
Sure.
been keen on recently?
I think in the copyright area, we have seen in the last 20 years, of course, a complete revolution in the whole means of production and distribution of cultural products. So take music, for example. You know, 20 years ago, 25 years ago, we were listening probably to CDs.
Yes, or tapes.
Yeah, that's right. So now it's all distributed and consumed on platforms, really, the various platforms. The same is happening. We don't watch television on television anymore. We watch it on a variety of devices. So there's been a complete transformation, really, in the production and distribution and consumption of cultural goods. And that brings with it a lot of challenges, because copyright really was born out of printing technology, books.
Yes.
And so that a lot of adjustment is required. Now, the same thing, of course, is happening with technology. We're going through what is variously called the fourth industrial revolution, or the digital revolution, or the data revolution, but also lots of ancillary revolutions like the biotech revolution, life sciences revolution. So extraordinary transformation in the technology, the whole means of production in the economy. And that again requires some adjustment, because again the patent system was really born in the Industrial Revolution, You know, so you went in the Industrial Revolution from artisan production
Yes.
To industrial manufacture, mass production. And what became important was not the ownership of one particular object that was made by an artisan, but the ownership of the technology that allowed a multiplicity of those objects to be manufactured. Now we're going through another transformation, of course. That was, of course, the first one was machine power really replacing human labor to some extent. Now we're seeing machines replacing intellectual labor to some extent.
AI.
Yeah, that's right.
Also tell us about, I mean, we have been seeing more and more cases of intellectual property disputes.
Yes.
Could you maybe give us a few examples? I know there are major ones, very popular, famous ones as well, and why these problems arise.
Yeah, well, you see, given the transformations that we were speaking about a little earlier, then competition really is focused on new technology.
Yes.
So disputes arise out of competition and the intensity of the competition. Plus, I think we see that the competition is really global. So we have this intense global competition, and it's really focused on new technologies because new technologies give you the competitive advantage in the marketplace, innovation. And so I think it's a fairly natural development that that's where we see the focus of differences between companies. And of course, the big challenge in the area of intellectual property is, you know, what is the difference between legitimate copying on the one hand and illegitimate copying on the other hand? Now you must, there is a certain scope for legitimate copying, otherwise you couldn't have a fashion. You know, a fashion must have certain elements in common. And so there's a certain legitimate side to it, but there's an illegitimate side to it. And that is when you actually appropriate or take the whole, if you like, of another company's idea or technology or its brand. You imitate, you know, the brand, you counterfeit the brand. Or you take the whole of the design that they have developed and which is original for a product. So this fine line is what the differences and the disputes are all about. And the famous cases, as you have mentioned, are really, one company saying, well, that's a very good idea. That's where the market is going to go. We want to get in on that. Now, to what extent can they do that without infringing the intellectual property of the other company?
It's very tricky. I was quite surprised by a tattoo artist actually filing a lawsuit against, because it was his design and it was shown in a particular movie, and I was wowed. I was like, wow.
So that's
Very
a great
tricky.
example, and
Yes.
it shows you how intellectual property is now in everything.
Yes.
You know, that's where the competitive advantage is.
Now, what is the correlation between economic development and IP, and what is the role of the IP system that promotes economic growth, perhaps?
Yeah, well, look, a lot of people, of course, talk about intellectual property protection and the emphasis on the protection. That's natural given the competition that we were talking about. But it's also an enabler, intellectual property. You know, if you're a young startup, let's say, you're a young company or you've got a great idea, then intellectual property protection actually enables you to have some protection for that in this very difficult journey from having the idea and making it a final marketed product.
Yes.
And where lots of other people are going to be interested in jumping in and taking your idea. So it's an enabler, really. Every economy in the world, whether it's pre-industrial, industrial, or post-industrial, you know, has certain advantages. I think that the secret for a country is to build up its technological capacity. And intellectual property can help do that. For the poorer countries, for the least developed countries, I think the challenge is there are so many pressing priorities that investing in this rather long-term process of building up technological capacity is difficult. It's difficult when you don't have adequate health care systems, for example, or you don't have adequate water sanitation systems, really primary needs. And in a certain sense, innovation is a surplus activity. And it's a long-term game. You see, countries that have done it in the shortest possible times, like Korea. Singapore, China, Japan to a certain extent after the Second World War, it took 40 years, 30, 40 years. So it's really 6 decades between Korea as really a very poor economy and society to the flourishing Korea that we now see.
Yes.
And innovation and intellectual property have played a very important role in that, in building technological capacity. But it's only been by a concentrated, long-term, focused, strategic vision.
Yes. It seems as though many countries are making efforts to strengthening IPR protection. Is that intellectual?
Yeah. Yes, that's right.
Property
Intellectual
rights protection.
property rights protection. Yes,
IPR protection. How does the international community see the status of Korea's IPR protection?
Look, I think Korea's a leader. It's definitely a leader in IP protection and IP, and in the use of IP. You know, again, in using IP to enable, new activities, like some of the activities we see in the flourishing cultural, creative works of Korea. So that's a good example, isn't it? You've got really a lot of innovation and creativity going into this, and IP is enabling a lot of that. Esports, these are good examples of really creative, new cultural works. And IP is essential to the business model.
More and more Korean companies are entering the overseas market, the global market, and IP infringement cases are on the rise as well. Yes. So what might be some measures to protect these companies? Yeah,
well, I think you, as a company, you have to have protection in the markets in which you're going to operate. Let me give you one example, if I may. I met several years ago Mr. Rubik, who invented the Rubik's Cube. And when he did that, he took out patent protection in Europe and North America only because he, at that stage, didn't have much finance, and he didn't take it out in Asia. Well, the Rubik's Cube became fantastically popular in Asia, and zillions of Rubik's Cubes were made, and he was not able to get anything out of that because he didn't have the protection. So you really need to think about your markets, where your product's going to be popular, where you think it's going to be popular, and you need protection in those markets.
Even if you're not sure?
Even if you're not sure. So look, that's actually a real problem and a dilemma for a startup, isn't it? Because they're really struggling to get their finance together, to get the product off the ground, or the service off the ground. And IP protection is not cheap. And that's one of the things we have to, from a policy point of view, be very careful about, to make sure that we don't kill the goose that laid the golden egg.
Yeah, I think that may be one of the biggest concerns if you're, do you have problems with funds and, financially you need help and you're not able to protect your own.
But this is your basic asset, isn't it?
That's true.
Your idea is your basic asset, so that you really want to invest in that.
Yes. As you've mentioned, in the age of the fourth industrial revolution, AI is definitely gaining much interest, domestically and internationally. So I read that WIPO has recently published a tech report on AI. So could you perhaps summarize maybe a few points, the main points of it, and also its implications for Korea?
Yeah, so what we did is look at all scientific publications since the 1950s and all patent applications since the 1950s in the field of AI and to see how it's developed. That means about 1.6 million scientific publications and about 340,000 patent applications. Wow. And what comes out of the analysis, or landscape, if you like, is quite interesting. It's in many respects what we thought we knew. It's telling us. So we see that 50% of the patent applications, for example, have been filed in the last 5 years, since 2013. So you have this long period of development, but then this surge. And that great surge is, of course, machine learning and the advances in machine learning and neural networks, the technology under machine learning. And that's what we're seeing as the big surge right at the moment, I think. Another thing is that it tells us is that actually the United States and China are out in front. They're out in front in terms of the amount invested in research and development for AI. They're out in front in terms of the number of publications, the number of patents, and the number of products. But Japan is also a strong performer, and Korea is a strong performer. Europe is actually a little behind.
Oh, is that right?
According to this analysis and landscape. They're not investing, they have not been investing. I think they're very acutely aware of this now and want to try to rectify it. They haven't been investing as much as the other countries mentioned, and they haven't got as many products out on the market. Now, this is a very interesting phenomenon, and why is this so? It's concerned with policy attention, of course. It's concerned with what companies are doing. By the way, there are strong performers in Europe, for example, Siemens in medical technology and artificial intelligence. So it's not as though they're non-existent, but comparatively, it's different. So I think another little thing, if I may say, is we see the surge since the 1950s, since the start of activity, for scientific publications taking place around about 2003. The surge in patent applications is about 2013. So the curve goes like this and then like this. It's a very nice sequencing of science preceding technology. So the science gets developed, and then the the practical applications get developed about 10 years later. So it's an interesting, I think, report.
Okay, so once again, I'm going to mention that you are here in Korea on a very tight schedule, just arrived 2 days ago. We are going to take a quick break, take a look at some photos of your activities here in Korea, and we'll be right back to continue our interview. Francis Gurry is making his 3rd visit to Korea this year. On June 14th, he addressed the topic Global Intellectual Property Trend as a keynote speaker at the 9th International Intellectual Property and Industrial Security Conference. Francis Gurry, Director General of WIPO since 2008, is a leading authority on intellectual property affairs. What may be some of his past achievements? So you became Director General in 2008, and you were re-elected in 2014. So could you tell us about the projects that you've worked on as Director General of WIPO and perhaps some of the greatest achievements?
One big project was really the digital transformation of the organisation. The method of delivery of services has completely changed. So the method of delivery of our services to all of our stakeholders worldwide has changed and has, of course, gone to a digital platform and digital services. So that's been a big project, really enhancing customer experience. In terms of rule-making, now that's a very difficult area because you have to really get the whole world to agree about something. And today, that's extremely difficult. You know, they don't agree about the time of day, generally now at the moment. But we managed to do that, the organisation, the member states managed to do that in a couple of areas. And I think one of the things that I think we're probably most proud of is what we call the Marrakesh Treaty, which is a treaty that establishes, facilitates access to published works for blind persons and visually impaired persons. So this treaty allows you to break copyright protection to make an accessible format of a book, for example. So to make a braille copy or an audio copy that's accessible to blind persons if it's not available to them. And furthermore, to exchange that internationally. around that treaty and based on that treaty, we've built up, in a partnership with publishers, authors, publishers, libraries, the World Blind Union, a repertoire of about 460,000 works now that are available in accessible formats and that can be freely exchanged by libraries and others for blind persons. And we've also developed in local languages a lot of accessible format texts for primary students, secondary students and tertiary students. So I think that's been a great project.
Yes.
And it's a really nice project because everyone agrees about it. Nobody is in disagreement, and that's really a wonderful thing when you get that conjunction of circumstances.
Could you also maybe tell us about, you talked about how WIPO and Korea has collaborated on many projects. Could you maybe tell us about them?
Sure. So Korea has been a generous donor to the organisation and a donor for the purpose of capacity building in developing countries. So a lot of the experience that Korea has, of course, is extremely relevant to developing countries because Korea has made the journey. It's been there and it's now there. So that's something that everyone wants to know about. How did you do that? So I think this is one big area, training, capacity building. We have a lot of collaborations in this through the generosity of Korea. We also are partners in respect of the operation of our international systems, and that's a lot of technical work. Let me give you one example. One example would be the translation of Korean documents and Korean patents into other languages and vice versa. So we have an AI-based system for this, and we're collaborating with KIPO, the Korean Intellectual Property Office, to improve the performance of that, and you improve the performance by, of course, data and the availability of data, which KIPO has. So that's another sort of more technical area in which we cooperate. So I think we have cooperation in many, many areas. And of course, Korea is a member state, so you know, Korea is my boss. You know, we are the Secretariat, and the member states are the ones that run the organisation. So Korea is amongst those that set the policy agenda that we need to follow.
I'd also like to ask you, where do you see the trends of IP, intellectual property, I guess, moving towards in the future?
Intellectual property is the basis of, and technology, competitive advantage economically, also, by the way, militarily. So this, I think, is something that we are going to have to learn to manage better as a world, as a global community. I'm not sure we know how to do that, or have ever known how to do it for that matter. And that's a big challenge, I think, for the world.
And I'm down to my final question. I'd like to ask you about the goals you hope to achieve during your time as Director General at WIPO.
Look, I think that what we would like to be as an organisation is an open organisation. That's very important, openness. An inclusive organisation. You know, we have to include the whole world, and the world's a very diverse place. And we have to also then be state-of-the-art. State-of-the-art in the delivery of our services, and state-of-the-art in what we're talking about as a community, you know, addressing the problems or the challenges that exist there, exist in the world and are being thrown up by new technologies. And that requires an agility, as we always say these days, and a speed which, you know, international organisations are not necessarily accustomed to. So we have to be able to have the capacity to develop a conversation that has some meaning around what are the needs in the field of artificial intelligence, for example.
Today's talk was very interesting. It was a time for me to learn a lot about IP. And of course, it shows that WIPO does have a very huge role, is playing a very important role in protecting intellectual property worldwide, and that role, of course, the importance of that role is definitely increasing ever by ever. I'd like to thank you very much for your time today. It was very interesting. I learned much about IP and WIPO's role in protecting intellectual property worldwide is ever becoming more critical. I'd like to thank you once again for sharing your valuable time.
Thank you.
감사합니다.
It's my great pleasure. 감사합니다.
고맙습니다. Thank you.
Thank you.